Okay, we're going now with the Best of the West in art, movie, music, and books by me, Pete Rogers. We're talking about the first things to be achieved by the ancient Greeks. And like Will Durant had said, the great historian, most of the things that are secular and like modern technological, electrical, they all came from ancient Greece. Okay, so first of all, it was the first country to have free speech on a widespread basis for the aristocrats. So they had an aristocratic population. Most places of the ancient world were all run by tyrants. Dictators would just say, "Do as I say, or I'll kick your butt." Versus ancient Greece, they had these big, public debates amongst the aristocrats. Okay, it was the first place to have this epic poetry like the Iliad and the Odyssey by Homer. So here's a painting of the Wrath of Achilles, which is sort of a big, dramatic high point of, the Iliad. Okay, here's the Wrath of Achilles where he dragged Hector behind his chariot. And so Achilles was a bit brutal, but the idea of the story was to inspire young men to defend Greece, because Greece had been pretty heroic, for example, in fighting off the Persians, which much outnumbered them. Here's Odysseus and the sirens. He's chained to the mast so he won't be called away by the sirens, as beautiful women can distract us from our duties. His men who are rowing the oars have their ears covered so they will not be taken away by the siren song. Painting by Herbert James Draper there. Here's Odysseus when he first returns to Ithaca and he kisses the ground. He's so happy. He's been away for 20 years, 10 years in the Trojan War and another 10 years wandering. And Athena is by him, guiding him. Painting by Jan Sticka, the Polish author. Okay. And so if you want to be an educated person and just have a reasonable sense of what mankind is capable, the high points of mankind. You can learn about the low points of mankind at any historical period. There's always evil things going on. But to see the ultimate of what mankind is capable of, you have to study the ancient Greeks. So back home in Ithaca, Odysseus slays the suitors of Penelope, who had abused his home and hospitality. Okay, painting by Monsal. All right. And then probably the best painting of Greek mythology is this one right here by The Birth of Venus by Sandro Botticelli. Sandro Botticelli was a favorite artist of the Medicis in Italy, Florence, Italy. And his Birth of Venus is magnificent, okay? And you can see the Greeks and the Italians had a wonderful sense. The high points of cultural achievement in human history are the ancient Greeks, the Italians of the Renaissance, like 1400 to about 1650, and also the 1800s in Europe. And notice all of it comes from Western civilization. The highest three cultural phases in all of mankind's history all come from Western civilization. Western civilization is quite superior to all other civilizations. I say that based on objective fact. Okay, look it up for yourself. That's why multiculturalism is nonsense. Okay, other countries are living in little, teepees. Okay, whereas Western civilization is producing work like this. It's magnificent. It's sublime. Okay, it's important to say that because currently, the billionaire perverts are trying to destroy all of Western civilization, get rid of it. They want to bring back slavery, and people should be aware of how great it is, and be willing to say, no, we want to keep Western civilization. Look how great it is. There's nothing to compare to it. What are you going to trade this for? Drag Queen Story Hour? Are you going to replace this? Are you out of your mind? Younger generation doesn't know any of this stuff. That's why they should learn about it, so they'll realize they have something worth preserving. They've inherited the greatest legacy of human achievement and culture and sophistication and beauty ever, and they want to throw it in the garbage? Stupid. Okay? If you don't have Christian ethics in the Bible, man is created in the image of God, then you've got nothing, no moral foundation, and you're just a talking monkey, and you have no rights, and you are headed towards slavery. That's a fact. It's obvious to anybody who knows basic logic, basic history. It's obvious. I don't know why that's hard to understand, because so many people, they've had their IQs lowered by the fluoride in the water, the aluminum in the water, the public schools, so they really have no thinking ability. It's kind of sad, but in my experience, that's a lot of people. Okay, here's a painting by Diego Velázquez, Apollo in the Forge, of Vulcan telling him that his wife Venus is cheating on him with Mars, the god of war. Okay. Here's another painting by Sandro Botticelli. This one's called Primavera, Springtime. And again, it's just beautiful. and you just have this sense of what mankind is capable of. Once your eyes see this, you can't forget it. It's so magnificent. And it's a great thing for young people to see it, because as Aristotle had said, for young people to see the great writing of the playwrights, the poets, it gives them an inspiration to how life could be, how it ought to be, what they can aspire to, that you can take your mind out of the gutter and try to do something good with your life, that life has meaning. Mankind is capable of doing magnificent, wonderful, beautiful things. That's an important thing for a young person to learn, because if a young person just hangs around their little social club, the little idiots in their, their junior high, their high school, their college, as far as they're concerned, the only thing to do is get drunk on the weekend and, act like a fool, try to get laid. And they don't have a sense of aspiring to doing something great or beautiful. And it takes that long-term sense in order to achieve something special. Okay, here's Antigone arrested for helping to bury her brother Polynices after the, sort of the civil war in Thebes, and the new king Creon. Polynices and Eteocles, sort of inadvertently killed each other. And then King Creon said, leave Polynices to the dogs, don't bury him. Antigone tried to give her brother a decent burial, at least a ceremonial burial. And then King Creon imprisoned her. She was engaged to his son. Okay, it's Creon's son. And he said, why did you disobey my edict? And Antigone said, yes, I knew what I was doing. And King Creon says, and you have transgressed the law. Antigone, your law, but not the law of justice that dwells with the gods. The unwritten laws of heaven are not of today, nor yesterday, but are for all times. Okay, so Antigone made a very heroic statement there. And that's what you want, is that there is an appeal to authority that goes outside the conventional secular ruler, because that's what gives people their rights. And you need that in a society, otherwise you've got tyranny and slavery. Okay, so that's why it's so magnificent. And the Greeks were on top of all this stuff many years ago. Okay, so here's some quotes by Victor Davis Hanson. He's a great Greek historian. He said, the Greeks assumed that cultures separate from them our natural savage selves, and that no culture did better than the world of their own city-state. The Greeks considered everybody outside of their own place as barbarians. And that's a normal thing to do. Any culture always thinks that everyone else is inferior to their culture. Okay. There's only Western civilization that can objectively prove it, though. Western civilization, where does all this stuff come from? The automobile, the radio, all these basic things, the theory of gravity, the record player, the photography camera, etc., the train engine. Okay, pride in one's culture was not chauvinism, but simply a logical and necessary appreciation for a system that required sacrifice and responsibility from the individual system. So if you're going to tell all the young men that they should defend the country with their lives, they deserve to have a reason why that's worth them to do that. Okay. And this city-state in return gave them material bounty and personal freedom undreamed of by others. The assumptions of Sophocles' Antigone and basic Greek approaches to human experience reflect the origins of Western culture. They cannot be dismissed as simplistic moral platitudes. They are not merely different from other cultures. Rather, they illustrate the reasons why we in the West are what we are. Yeah, the West is unique. There's nothing like it. Okay, as Edith Hamilton wrote in her great books about the ancient world, the Greeks were the first Westerners. They believed in freedom. All the other ancient cultures are tyranny. And the Romans, too, were primarily tyrannical, okay? Primarily collectivist. Slavery was big, and they were cruel. What they did to the gladiators, what they did to the Christians in the Colosseum. Okay, the next first for the Greeks. The first historian to write in prose, Herodotus, who's called the father of history. He wrote about the Persian War. And he's another one of these guys that was a bit of an outcast. He was sort of a half-breed between being part Greek, part Persian, so he could understand both cultures. Okay? And they called him, I think was a funny name, some Greeks called him a Philo-Barbarus. So philo as in to love, barbarians, because he wrote much nicer about the Persians than a purely Greek person would have written. So they called him a Philo-Barbarus, Philo-Barbarian. I thought that was funny. Lover of barbarians. Okay, in a modern world we might call him a Philistine. The first skeptical Machiavellian type historian, and that would be Thucydides writing about the Peloponnesian War. again, many of the greatest books of all time have been written by men who were outcasts, pariahs, exiles. Thucydides had been an admiral in the Athenian army, and he had been disgraced. He felt unfairly, and he tried to redeem himself by writing the magnificent history of the Peloponnesian War. He said, my history is not just, a brief summary to be popular in our moment. It is to stand for all time of how men behave in such conflicts. Okay, and it was an all-time masterpiece. I read that in college, my first year of college, and that had an effect on me. It was magnificent. Okay, the first Olympic Games. The Greeks, as Edith Hamilton said, they enjoyed playing. The Olympic Games were competition. They're beautiful. Every 4 years, and that's sort of how they time things by, the year of the Olympiad. Okay, whereas the Roman Colosseum, as Edith Hamilton described, that was not played. The gladiators died at the end of the conflict. The Roman Christians that were sacrificed, martyrs to Christ, they died in the Colosseum. Okay. The first theater with the great playwrights, they would have competitions every year in Athens, who had written their greatest play. And the 4 greatest playwrights of all time were Aeschylus, who had served in the Persian Wars, Aristophanes, the comedic playwright who mocked Socrates in The Clouds, Euripides, who mocked Socrates, and Sophocles. Pythagoras, one of the earliest philosophers, who was the proponent of the vegetarian diet, was called Pythagorean diet. Very big on mathematics, the Pythagorean theorem. He also figured out the octave scale of string instruments that carried on to modern music. Here he is with his followers celebrating the sunrise. He didn't need animals because he felt they could be reincarnated humans. Plato wrote that if a man was immoral, he would be reincarnated instead of being as a man, as an animal or a woman. They had the first philosophers. There was a lot of pre-Socratics who were heavily into thinking. I'm currently reading a book right now called The Dream of Reason by Anthony Gottlieb, and he goes into great detail about what each of these individual philosophers thought, not just the big three, the gang of three, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, but all these others, Parmenides, and all the rest of them. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle are the foundation of philosophy. Alfred North Whitehead said all of philosophy is a footnote to Plato. Platonism is sort of part of the letter of the law in Protestant philosophy, and whereas Aristotelianism led to Catholicism and freedom and capitalism. Okay, Protestantism kind of got distorted, if you will, a little bit into the cow, the moon, and the east as it was taken over by a secular ruler, and the religion was sort of removed from there, except in show. The post-Socratics, the school of cynicism, like Diogenes was part of that. Skeptics, Epicureans, Stoicism, the Cynics, okay, they were heavily into philosophy, the ancient Greeks. All these words, they all come from ancient Greek, all these words of basic philosophical thinking and metacognition, thinking about thinking. The first serious biologists, Alexander the Great, would bring back animal specimens to Aristotle so he could classify them, and he did. He was the world's first serious biologist with the equivalent of a college with a biology degree and a medical school. Okay, and he had the first big library. Aristotle's like the great hero of intellectual achievement. Ayn Rand had said, if there is an atlas upon which the intellectual world rests, it would be on Aristotle. Here's Alexander the Great of Macedonia being presented to Aristotle, who was also a Macedonian. He had gone to Athens to have the opportunity to study with Plato. But when Plato was dying, he gave his school to be run by another one of the students, even though Aristotle was the best student. The other student was more of a conformist, kiss-ass to Plato, whereas Aristotle would argue with Plato. So Aristotle was pissed off, so he went back to Macedonia. And during that time, he tutored Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great loved him. Alexander the Great loved Greek culture. It was so clearly superior to the Macedonians and anything else that he'd seen. So when Alexander the Great conquered the Mediterranean world and surrounding regions, he spread Greek culture to all those places. Alexander the Great died in 323 BC, and he died. That was sort of the end of the ancient Greek classical age and the beginning of what was called the Hellenistic age. So Hellenic means Greek. Hellenistic means Greek-like. So the Hellenistic age, whereby the Greek generals that had worked under Alexander the Great now spread that influence to all these other areas like Alexandria and their other conquered regions. And this sort of spread Greek culture and language to later eras that would be influenced by Christianity. So here's that painting of Alexander the Great giving animal specimens to Aristotle, the biologist, to classify them. And, Charles Darwin had said, Cuvier and Linnaeus were just schoolboys in comparison with Aristotle. Aristotle was this big cheese in biology and classifying animals. Okay. People sometimes try to mock Aristotle based on mistakes made in the students' notes. We've lost 75%. 75% of Aristotle's writings are lost, yet the 75% that were preserved, the 25% that were preserved, were the main influence of all education, grade school, high school, college level for the next 1,500 years. That's how great a genius Aristotle was. Okay, here's the painting of Alexander the Great cutting the Gordian knot. So the Gordian knot was something you would have to untie, and Alexander just chopped it with a sword. There's a great song about Alexander the Great called Alexander the Great by Iron Maiden, if you want to hear that. The point of it was Alexander the Great cut through the BS and just got things done. Okay, the first library in Aristotle's school, the Lyceum, with a large collection of scrolls. First scholars of rhetoric like Demosthenes and Aristotle. Here's Demosthenes, trying to speak by the loud noise of the ocean shore with a pebble in his mouth. He had been sort of ripped off of his inheritance, and he was poor, so he had to negotiate in the law courts by himself. And so he's training himself to become a better orator, and that was a big goal of all the young Greek aristocratic men, was to try to become a good orator. The Trojan Horse by Giovanni Tiepolo, Odysseus' idea on how to break through the walls of Troy, which was successful. Okay. Odysseus was the cleverest of the ancient Greeks. So here's another painting of the same thing, the Trojan horse that had been taken into Troy. And then at night the Greeks climbed out and they opened up the gates and they sacked Troy. Okay, the first genius engineers of science were from the ancient Greeks, and that included Archimedes, the great one. Also Euclid, who wrote the geometry textbooks. Okay, Ptolemy, the astronomy system. Okay, they had the early scientific theories like of the atom, all kinds of stuff. It's rather extraordinary. The Greeks basically taught themselves to scientifically reason and develop all these concepts. It's quite extraordinary. The Romans did a few things. They built aqueducts and stuff. Archimedes held off an entire Roman invasion of Syracuse until somebody betrayed them and opened up a gate from inside. Some traitor was paid off to do that. Archimedes even had a simplistic version of calculus. The first great building is the Parthenon. Oh, I should have put a painting of the Parthenon in there. I have a good one by Edwin Church. Okay, here's the Greeks, sort of the flowering of ancient Greeks. They had extraordinary architecture for that time. So that's the ancient Greeks back in, 420 BC. They're making these magnificent buildings like the Parthenon up on the Acropolis, and Phidias, his statue of Athena. Okay, other cultures around the world were illiterate savages, living in teepees and the equivalent in huts. Okay, so there was nothing like the ancient Greeks. Here, take a look at this. Here is the Acropolis, the city on the hill, Athens, the city on the hill that carried over into Bible metaphor. Okay, and so what Christianity did to the rest of the world later to that was gave them some beautiful thing they could aspire to with freedom, getting rid of slavery. Okay, you need capitalism, you need Christianity, and you need a constitution. Christian ethics is what you need in order to have a free, rich society. If you don't have that, you'll have endless war, and you'll have slavery, and you have all kinds of things you don't want. Okay, look how magnificent it was. There's the great statue of Athena. Okay, there's the Parthenon, and here's the famous speech of Pericles, his funeral oration as described in Thucydides' book on the Peloponnesian War. Okay, they made the first great sculptures. They had the first sophisticated navy, the very sophisticated military tactics. Okay, with their phalanx, but they just were severely outnumbered by the Persians, who they managed to defeat, but they later on couldn't defeat the Romans, of course. They were great at mathematics, like I said, between Archimedes and Euclid and Plato and Pythagoras. Plato was very heavily into mathematics. That was a requirement for his school. Ptolemy, the great Greek astronomer, first astronomy system. Athens, the first democracy, the polis. They had a great sense of humor. The Greeks would argue back and forth. They were quite funny, you know. A lot more sense of humor than the Romans, certainly. Here's Diogenes with a lantern looking for one honest man. Okay. Okay. Here is Phryne at the Areopagus, the Greek court, where she had broken some of the rules and they were about to declare her guilty and sentence her to death. And then in front of all the male jury, her lawyer just disrobed her. And when all the men saw how beautiful she was, they said, what a waste it would be to kill her. She looks like a model to make a statue of Venus. We should just let her go free. So they let her go free. Okay, then, the sad truth is, why did ancient Greek fall? Because they couldn't unify, they couldn't get along. That's very commonly the problem that makes a country weak. That's also what happened with Ireland. So you have a country like Ireland ruled by a bunch of separate individual chieftains, and they don't unify and get along. Then a big country neighbor nearby, like England, has a unified national army, and they kick the crap out of them, okay? And King Philip had fought with the Greeks and knew their military tactics, so he applied those to the Macedonians, and then they were later on able to conquer the Greeks, for example, okay? And then other countries, if they learn them, then they'd be too much. Okay, so that's all we got for today on the ancient Greeks. I hope you found that helpful.